box with a slip-fit lid is a great accomplishment, but a box with a lid that unscrews is very special. In this videotape, number 5 in a series, using the Klein Design lathe, I'll be showing you how to make a box with a threaded lid. But first I'd like to show you a threading jig. This thread cutting jig has evolved over a long period of time, nearly 2 years. Lots of questions were asked. I did a lot of reading. Basically, it consists of a lead screw. It's held in 2 uprights. This lead screw is 16 threads per inch. It's held between 2 nuts that are also threaded 16 threads per inch, so when this rotates, it advances it at the proper rate. These 2 nuts provide an opportunity to load the lead screw. It takes all the play out of it. You can twist these and make it tighter or looser, and then you anchor it down with a couple of screws, and it takes all the play out of it. You don't want any wobble at all in there. It will generate mistakes in the threads if you do. The spindle of the lead screw is threaded for my lathe, 3/4 16, and it has a true face for the chuck to come up against. It's very important, so that you can take the chuck on and off the lead screw and have it true every time. On this end of the threaded cutting jig, I have a cutter bit mounted in a Fordham handpiece. This cutter bit is an off-the-shelf item. It's called a 60-degree double angle cutter. It comes with a 3/8 of an inch shank. I had to have the shank reduced to fit into the Fordham handpiece. If you were to use another way of driving the cutter bit, a router or die grinder, you may be able to accommodate the 3/8 inch shaft. I've held the Fordham handpiece in a couple of V-blocks mounted in a cross-slide vise. This cross-slide vise is used for a drill press, but it gives us the adjustments we need at this end of the thread cutting jig. It has in and out adjustments to accommodate different diameters of boxes. It has the left and right adjustment, and that would accommodate either a box, a higher or lower box. And I'll generate some threads using this. I'll bring it in just a little bit. I rotate it forward until just the tips of the cutter bit are rubbing against the wood. And I'll back the wood out of the way. And I'll advance this cutter bit the correct amount for the depth of thread that I need. And I know from experience the amount that is. We'll go into that later. And I cut it in one. This Fordham handpiece turns at 10,000 RPM. And it's just a matter of rotating the cutter, the workpiece past the cutter bit. Bit out as it's slowing down, because if it sits there in one place and turns, it'll burn a little mark in your workpiece. Those threads are nice and clean. And that's basically the process. I wouldn't cut nearly that many rows of threads, but I just want to give you an idea how well it works. The speed with which you rotate this piece would have be determined by the type of wood you're using. Real hard wood, you turn a little bit slower. So that's basically the idea of how the jig works. For those of you that would like a real challenge, there's an old way of doing thread cutting. These are called thread chasers. I've also seen them when they've been called thread cleaners. But they come in pairs. This would be for the outside threads, these would be for inside threads, and they're matched so that the teeth would mesh, so that the threads would mesh. And they're available in different pitches. And I've experimented with these a little bit. We'll see if we can get some threads generated on this piece here. I'll use this one, which would be for the external threads. And I've experimented with the lathe running forward and the tool held this way. And I've experimented with the lathe running backwards and the tool held upside down. I'll try it this way, and we'll run the threads out to the end of the cylinder. I've slowed the lathe down to about 950 RPM, and it's a matter of picking a right speed. And it'll jump into the track each time. And each pass makes a little bit deeper. This is a real labor-intensive way to make threads, I say. But you can cut it deeper and deeper, and the threads would come up to little crisp points there. Just an idea. Maybe you'd like to try it if you're up for a challenge. Now I'm going to show you a much simpler way of creating a box with a threaded lid. But first of all, I'd like to talk a little bit about wood and seasoning of the wood and preparing the box blanks. If you have little pieces of wood that you want to make into a box, rough them down into a cylinder form and let them sit around like this. They'll stabilize quicker and be more useful in the cylinder forms. In the larger pieces, it's a good idea to go ahead and hollow some of the material out of the inside and a little bit out of the lid. Leave it much thicker than what you're going to use as a finished project, maybe at least 2 or 3 times the thickness. But this way the wood can stabilize and dry out a lot faster. The exotics will stay wet for a long time, so even though it may have been cut a couple years ago, if you cut into a 3-inch thick piece of wood, it could still have moisture in the inside. So this way you can assure yourself of a more stable box. Stability is important. If the wood is stable, less warping due to drying will occur. If the wood is unstable and movement occurs in a finished piece, this will affect the fit of the lid. Depending on the tolerances of a slip-fit lid, this can be more or less critical. But with a threaded lid, because it is turned to remove it, any warping will be noticed with tight and loose spots as it is removed, and I feel this would detract from the overall quality of the piece. I have this block that I've already turned into a cylinder. I've marked B for bottom and T for top. That way I can be assured that the grain will line up throughout the piece, as I've parted through the cylinder right here. So I'm going to mount the lid portion on the 3-jaw chuck first of all. Not being very cooperative. Okay, I put the lid part in with a T towards the chuck. And I like to make sure that this is good and solid, so I usually take a little extra tightening grip on that. And we'll chew up this surface. We don't want to remove much material because we want to preserve as much grain matching as possible, and that requires all the material that we can maintain there. I'm going to speed the lathe up just a little bit. We'll turn this about 2150. I don't need to true up the center portion because that part's going to be removed. Now we'll take the inside out and we'll prepare the inside of the lid first of all. I can take a lot of the material away with a shallow fluted gouge because it's not a very deep container. I've chosen a light colored wood to work on because it's easier to see. This is Eastern maple. Now I'm going to take a square-ended scraper and clean out more of the inside. This is one that's been sharpened on the end and sharpened on the side. We want to leave enough thickness to cut a thread. We'll be cutting into that material that's left. We also want to allow enough left on the outside to work with later. And we can check the depth and see what we've got so far. I made a little depth gauge, very simple. And we've got a lot there. I'll take a little bit more out of the inside. I can push forward, take it in steps, going straight in. Or I can push it to the side. And then we'll check this to see if the side is absolutely straight up and down. I'll lay a straight edge in there and compare that to the edge of the bed. Looks real good. Okay, now we're getting ready to cut the threads on this portion. I need to explain something before I proceed any further. This represents the box top, this represents box body. And when you cut threads in the box top and you cut threads in the box body, this thread runs up into solid ground right here. And you either need to have clearance in one of two places. You either need to cut material away from there for this thread to run into that area, or what I have found I prefer is to eliminate this area here, eliminate this thread, cut the equivalent of one thread in length and one thread in depth. So it's about a 1/16 of an inch long by a little bit of less than a 1/16 of an inch this direction. So I'll cut the clearance there. And then I like to bevel the material off at 45 degrees before I cut the threads. And the first thread doesn't ever have a very thin edge to it. It starts out with a little bit more strength. So the next step will be to cut this clearance in the top of the box lid. I'll go ahead and cut the step for clearance on the inside of the edge here. I'm going to cut about a 1/16 of an inch deep. Approximately 1/16 by 1/16. And I can use the scraper to make this little bevel. The 45 degrees just makes that first thread a little more substantial. It eliminates the real thin part of the first thread. And then I like to take just a little tiny chamfer on that edge there just so there's no sharp edges. And then it's a good idea to check the surface on either side. It's better to have the outsides long. That way you know the box will come together and there won't be a gap there. And then the next thing I like to do is flow a little super glue, a little of the hot stuff glue over the area where the threads are going to be cut. And that just soaks into the wood and penetrates the area just a little bit and makes those threads a little stronger. Some wood this isn't necessary. It's almost something I do just as a precautionary measure on all of them. You never know when there might be just a little defect or a flaw in the wood. It eliminates the possibility of maybe the threads chipping out on the tips. And I'll go ahead and finish this area. I'll use some spray shellac as a sealer. Sometimes if it doesn't go on that way, just go ahead and squirt it right into the container. I always like to seal the wood, and shellac is what I like the best of all. Any kind of finish just looks a little bit better with a sealer on the wood first. And that's penetrated real evenly into the end grain. I might work a little bit more into that later. Now this is all ready to have the threads cut in this area. So we'll get the threading jig set up and we'll do the next step. I'd like to show you a much simpler threading attachment. It's actually an attachment for the lathe. We'll slide the tailstock off. This is the threading jig. This fastens on where the tailstock was. I have a little crank on the side that moves this table back and forth. The lead screw is held in this block, has a handle, has a spindle on the spindle nose, same diameter as the spindle nose on the headstock. So it's a much smaller, more compact unit and is actually an attachment for the lathe. So we'll fasten this on the tailstock. We can move it up into place. We'll take the workpiece off the headstock, fasten it onto the jig. Just make sure it's nice and tight, square up against the shoulder. I'll just move this out of the way just a little bit, and we'll put the thread cutting bit in the headstock. There's a collet that fits in the nose of the headstock and a little collet closer. We'll put this on the headstock. And I want it to stick out about 1 inch. I'll take a pair of pliers and tighten this up. I always like to turn it on and make sure that the bit's running true. My lathe just came unplugged. Yeah, it looks fine. And we're going to cut these threads just a little bit faster than we would normally turn. I'm going to turn this up to, it's about 3150. I also have another speed about 5000. I've cut some threads at 3150 and it seems to be just cuts real nice threads. I think it has a lot to do with how sharp the cutter bit is. Now we'll move this into place. We have some movement back and forth with the lead screw. So I'll lock it into place with the tailstock clamp. I didn't get that tight on in here. Okay, and we'll advance this forward a little bit, move the table over. We want the teeth just to brush the surface. Okay, and then we'll back the workpiece out of the way, and we'll advance the threads into the area to be cut. There are formulas that you can use to figure this out. You can also use it trial and error. If it's not deep enough, cut a little bit deeper. I like the threads to be cut with just a tiny, tiny flat left on the surface, on the peaks. And I've determined that that's about 35 to 37 thousandths. And the little dial is calibrated 50 thousandths for 1 revolution. So I'm going to advance it about 35 thousandths to start with. That makes it right about there. Looks good. This is the exciting part, actually cutting the threads. Turn the lathe on. I like to cut plenty of rows there because it allows more freedom of movement for adjustment when it mates to the bottom of the little box. You have plenty of rows here, you never run out of threads. So those are all ready. They look real good. Okay, we're finished cutting the threads in the lid of the box. We'll slide this out of the way. We'll go ahead and take this all the way off the lathe. It'll be in our way. We'll take the chuck off the jig. Set that aside. Take the cutter bit out of the headstock. And we'll put the chuck back on the headstock. Now this is the time when we'll be taking this piece. Well, we'll need to do a little bit of sanding first, and then we'll take it out of there. The threads are just a little bit rough on the surface. And if you take the sandpaper and just touch it to the surface of the threads, it'll take away a lot of that fuzziness. They look real clean now. And I'll take a pencil, and I always have one of the jaws of the chuck marked. And just as a precaution, mark the box blank, so that if you ever have to put it back into the jaws, it'll go back where you want it. And we'll put the bottom marked with a B into the chuck. Make sure it's seated all the way to the bottom. And we'll true this up. Going just a little faster than I'd like. Turn it down to about 2150. True up the outside of this a little bit. Before we can excavate the interior of the box, we need to determine the proper diameter of the outside. And you can take a pair of calipers and measure the inside diameter at the top of the threads. That measures 46 on the little dial. We have to add material to this diameter, and I know that it needs to be just a little over a 32nd of an inch. So we'll increase this diameter by that much. We'll take a little bit. We'll just take a tiny bit to experiment with to see how much. We're still quite a ways away. I'm using about a 1/16 of an inch to determine this measurement, or the proper diameter. And if I've wasted it or gone too small, it's not going to change the the grain match too much. Okay, we need to go to about another 3/64. Okay, that's about right. Now I know that that diameter is correct. Now I know I can take out the interior and I know how much wall thickness I can allow. I am going to bring it down to about this diameter because threads will be cut into this surface. And it's better to take the inside out of the box before you do any of the final fitting of the threads and all that, because just taking the interior of the box out is going to relieve stress in the wood. And when you apply heat from sanding and moisture from finishing, that can do a lot to change things, change the situation. So we want to do all those things first, and then we will determine the proper fit and the actual proper measurement for the threads. So I'm going to make just a little bit of a recess with the gouge, and we're going to drill out the inside with the drill mounted in a handle, drill bit. This eliminates that little troublesome center part. Let's see what we've got to work with there. That looks good. We have a hole to start with, and I can go ahead and use the square-ended scraper and take a lot of that material out. Just remove it in steps. Raise it just a tiny bit. Tighten things down. Got a lot of tools here rattling around. I can use the scraper and go straight in and on the sides and clean that up a little bit. See how things look. Go just a little bit deeper. Okay, I'll go ahead and clean up this little surface. This edge really doesn't touch anything, but it's nice just to have it cleaned up. The surface that was on there was just a parting tool surface, so it wasn't very clean. And I like to make just a little chamfer on that edge just to make it softer to the touch. I would totally finish this with 220, 600, and a sanding sealer and a little bit of wax. This is a spray shellac. Now come around to the side and I'll finish cutting this diameter in preparation for the threads. Double check everything again. Okay, I'll cut this. I like this little tenon to be cut about 3/16 of an inch in length. Each 16th is one thread revolution. You can measure that with a, it's almost. And then I like to take the skew chisel and make a 45-degree bevel on that surface. That's where the first thread's going to be cut. We know that this diameter is much larger than we need, so we'll cut this down just a little bit. It gives the cutter bit a little bit more room to work. I can get closer with it. Cut this just a tiny bit more. I want to make sure that that's fairly straight there. Now we need to put, we'll touch it a little bit with sandpaper, and we'll flow some soot from of the thin hot stuff in this area also. Just strengthens up the fibers of the wood in that area. Be a little bit careful not to stick the rag to your fingers. Not that I've had to learn the hard way, of course. Okay. That looks real good. That's ready to have some threads cut into it. In preparation for cutting the threads, we take the chuck off the headstock and install the cutter bit. I'm still searching for cutter bits. It would be very nice to be able to buy one right off the shelf without having to have the shank ground down. At this time, all I have been able to find is one with a 3/8 inch shank, which is too big for the collets. So I'm still looking. I like the idea of having the 10 flutes. It makes a nice clean cut. I've already mounted the threading attachment on the tailstock plate. The block that's atop this little table has 4 adjustment screws in the top of it, which allows this block to be moved from one end of the table to the other. And that allows you to accommodate different diameters of boxes. And then the crank on the back side will allow you the adjustment you need for depth of thread. Okay, we move this up into position. tighten it down securely with tailstock plate. And I will adjust the workpiece so that the tips of the cutter bit just brush the surface. Then I back the workpiece out of the way. And I will advance the workpiece into the area of the cutter bit. I'm going to do about 35 thousandths. Anywhere from, that measurement can vary from 30 to 40 thousandths. And with wood, it's not quite as a precision material as metal is, so you may have to do a little bit of trial and error. It's better not to go too deep the first time. You always can cut it a little bit deeper. Because at this point, you can cut the threads and you can try the box lid on. If it's too tight, then you can cut them a little bit deeper. Okay, we're ready to cut the threads on this one. I'm going to speed the lathe up. That was going just a little bit too slow. I think I'll get a cleaner cut with a faster speed. I get to a point where the cutter bit is going to start cutting into the shoulder that I've left on the workpiece. I want to stop just short of that point. I may have been able to go a tiny bit further. So I can back this out of the way. As long as I don't move it lengthwise, I can bring the workpiece back up into the cutter bit and cut the threads again, and I won't have any misalignment. So I'm very careful just to move it from side to side, from this direction, in and out of the cutter bit. Now it looks like a real good fit. So we can live with that one. Now we put the workpiece back on the headstock and sand up those threads just a tiny bit. Okay, we need to remove the workpiece from the threading jig. Slide this out of the way. Take the cutter bit out. I think this is so exciting. This part, when that screws on, it's just something really magic about that. If you make some, if you look at the piece with the lid off, figure out where the grain lines up. I made some pencil marks before I started turning. This is the area where the grain is going to line up. And then you screw the lid on, and you can see just what needs to be done. Those arrows need to come into alignment. So all I need to do to make that grain line up is reduce the shoulder on this part just a little bit. And for each revolution, it's 1/16 of an inch. Well, this is less than a quarter of a turn, so I have very little to take off there. Sometimes you're not so lucky. Sometimes you have a half a turn. Sometimes you have any varying amount from 3/4 to maybe this. But the first thing I want to do before I do any alignment is to true up the top, the lid with the body of the box. Do a little bit of shaping, because this will creep forward as I'm turning. That's a little bit too fast. Reduce the speed again, down to about 2100. Need to be just a little bit careful about how much you take off there. You have threads cut into this thickness, so you have to be aware of that. You don't want to cut through the threads after all this work. going to do some shaping on the lid. I'm going to put an insert in the top of the lid. And we can take a parting tool and reduce this just a tiny bit and see what we can bring it a little closer into alignment. Oops. Ah. Good lesson there. Always turn your lathe off to adjust the tool rest. It's one of those self-teaching lessons. It's not one that I'm very good about, I must admit. Okay, it's just much easier to tell with the lid off. Line the grain up, pick some landmarks, and line it up. That's about what we want. See if we gained anything. Gained a little bit. But in the process of working the box lid on and off, it'll creep forward. The wood will just wear just a little bit. And even in the process of making this box right now, I won't come much closer than this, about that close, because the next day possibly it will have changed just ever so slightly and it might come into alignment. If you happen to go past an eighth of an inch, or I mean just a little bit, as much as an eighth of an inch maybe, that means you have to reduce this whole shoulder 1/16 of an inch down to get it back into alignment. You don't want to go past. You can come up a little short, and then the next day you can lay this down on a piece of sandpaper and take just a tiny bit off there to make the final fine-tune adjustment. So we'll get rid of some of those marks just so they won't be so confusing. And then also you want to do just a tiny bit of detailing on the edge. Now to make a little bevel at the joint, a little V-groove. And if you do the V-groove on one side, and then you have a place to put the point of the skew chisel to do the V-groove on the other side. There's always going to be some feeling of a joint there, and you want to detail it somehow so that it's not objectionable. And you can put a couple beads if you want. Sometimes I'll put a little V-groove below the joint or above the joint, and you're never sure exactly which one is the actual opening. Those can be sanded up. But first, before we stand on the side, I'm going to do an insert into the box top. For contrast, we're going to put a little inset into this of cocobolo. It'll contrast nicely with the light colored wood. First, we'll chew up the surface. And very importantly, we need to measure to make sure that we have enough thickness in the lid to do the little insert. We have a good solid 1/4 inch to play with. Now take a pair of dividers and measure the diameter of the insert and transfer that measurement to the lid, resting this point on the tool rest. Make a scratch line that appears underneath that tip. Now make sure you don't let that tip touch the wood because it'll flip it over onto your fingers. And we'll cut a little recess in that now. It's sort of a thin piece of wood, so we don't need to cut this very deep. I left that little point in the middle just to serve as a depth gauge. Now I can take it away. It's about as deep as I want it right there. And I'll take the square-ended scraper and clean up that surface. try it in, see if it fits. I prepared this little insert ahead of time. You can prepare quite a lot of them, just have them sitting in a little box ready. You want the bottom side flat and the sides perpendicular. It needs to be a tiny bit bigger. Okay, it's going to be plenty big. Sometimes you might have inserts with interesting patterns, and you might consider the grain direction when you're putting these in. I'll just line them up so all the grain's going this way. Both pieces are end grain, but there are lines. I like to use plenty of glue just for security. It'll fill any little voids if the piece isn't totally level. After I talked about the grain, I didn't get it lined up like I wanted to. It'll be okay. Okay, and then we can shape that piece right along with the box lid. This side of the insert was just a parting tool cut. It didn't really matter what the surface was because it gets finished at this stage. So just the bottom side of the insert has to be finished. Make a little shape in the center, come up to a little point. And we can detail a lot of those little parts, make them crisper. Whoops, with the point of the skew chisel. A little bead right where the joint, not a bead, a little bead groove where the joint was. The long point of the skew is able to reach down in the tiny little grooves. Looks pretty good. We put another little bead right about here. Shape that. Sort of tie in the little detail at the joint. This will be a sort of a repetition of that shape. I've got the grain going perpendicular to each other. It would have been nice, I think, to have it lined up. Okay, I'm going to just touch the edge of this just a little more, and we'll sand and finish the lid. This has changed a little bit already. Just from moving it, or moving it, having it screwing on a little bit further each time will change the trueness of the outside of it. We'll go ahead and sand this now. This is the last time that you'll be able to do anything with the lid. The inside of the lid is finished at this point, and this is when you do the final finishing on the outside of the lid. The bottom of the box we can reverse chuck and do a lot to the shaping of that. I never use the 3-jaw to hold any finished part of the project that I'm making. It's only the 3-jaw chuck is only used to hold a part that is yet to be finished. The chuck jaws leave, they're sharp and they dig into the wood and leave little dents that would be objectionable in a finished piece. A box like this could easily be made on a faceplate. It doesn't have to be made on a 3-jaw chuck. I use a 3-jaw chuck because it goes on off my threading jig just a little truer than a faceplate would. The faceplate sometimes has a little bit of slop in it on the thread, the way it fits onto the threading jig. Start with 220. This is 600. You can fold the sandpaper and get down into the little tiny grooves. You want to try to keep things crisp. Use the edges of the sandpaper. Don't just totally round over everything. Okay, we'll put a sealer on that. A little spray shelf on a rag. And I like to put this on with a lathe, just hand turn the lathe and make sure that it soaks in uniformly and then also down to little grooves. If the lathe is spinning and you put this on, sometimes it seals the surface so quickly that it doesn't have time to penetrate down into the end grain. And I take a dry part of the rag and buff that nearly dry. Sometimes I'll cut that surface back just a little bit with the Scotch-Brite type pad. All I'm interested in is that the wood is sealed. That's the basic purpose of that. Now apply a wax. The wax I use when the lathe is running is my favorite Kiwi boot polish. After a piece is off the lathe and you want to renew the finish, then you can use some carnauba wax on a rag buffing wheel. After a piece has been handled quite a bit, it sometimes needs to be buffed up again. It's a real easy way of doing it. Now the lid is finished, and we can take that off the workpiece, and we reverse the bottom of the box to finish it. Before we take the box lid off and reverse the bottom, we need to make sure everything is in alignment with what we want. Check the threads, make sure that they're clean. I usually just touch it just ever so slightly with sandpaper like that. Any little ragged edges, like where the threads are starting, sometimes need to be just touched up a tiny bit. Then we want to double check the alignment. We want the grain alignment real close, but not going past. I think I'm going to take a little bit more off the shoulder and let it creep up maybe another 1/4 of an inch. Okay, that's within, actually it's within less than 1/4 of an inch of being aligned. And that will probably be just fine after it's been handled and let stabilize for maybe a day. So that's great. And I don't usually finish a threaded area unless there's a lot of difference, a lot of contrast in the way the wood looks. Sometimes I'll put a tiny bit of wax on it. If you put the finish on there, the finish will raise the grain just a tiny bit, which can do quite a bit to changing your fit. So put a little bit of wax on mostly on the shoulder, not really a lot on the threads. Sometimes the contrast between finished and unfinished wood is just not real pleasant. That looks just great. Within 1/8 of an inch of having the grain line up. Okay, and one more thing that you need to check before you take this off. You can make your life so much easier. Since we're going to turn this around and recheck onto a tenon, we need to make sure that this surface is straight. So you can put a ruler in there and check it with the bed, see that it is parallel to the bed. And then it's a good idea to mark the workpiece again, just in case it has to go back in the lathe. And then it's ready now to take it out of the chuck. I have a waste block mounted on a face plate, and we'll cut a little tenon in that will hold the body of the box. And before you mount that on there, you want to make sure that you have enough depth to work with. Good idea to check that ahead of time. And I'll start with about 1/16 of an inch just to get an idea. To get it close. If I go too far, I haven't wasted a lot of wood. Almost. I don't like to put the box on the wood when it's moving. I just lightly hold it against there. Sometimes the friction between the two pieces of wood can burn a mark in your box. It's not easy to get that out once you've burned the line in there. I'm going to make a tenon about a little longer than 1/4 of an inch. And you want to make sure that it's going to sit down against something square, so clean up that surface. Okay, a little bit tight. This is when it's critical. I like to mark the faceplate as well, because I'll be taking this on and off the faceplate a couple times. I'll mark that as well so I can put it back on exactly the same way. Now it's fitting solid, and we'll take off some of the shape, some of the extra wood. After you reduce this down to the proper diameter, for design purposes, it's very difficult to look at this as half a box on the lathe and have an idea what it looks like. So I recommend putting the lid back on it and sitting it down and having a look at the shape. I'd like to see this just a little bit more rounded on the bottom edge. And we'll line up the marks again. Oh, I took the marks off. Should have made the mark on the bottom. A better way would have been to pick out one of the little grain lines and align that with the mark on the faceplate. I like the box bottoms to be slightly concave. Of course, there's different designs. Maybe you might want a little box that rocks around on a round bottom. And you can lay a ruler across the bottom just to see what you've got. Make sure that it's going to rest on the outside edges if that's what your intention is. And we can clean that up a little bit with the skew. Make a nice sharp groove there. And to make it look like the bottom is genuinely turned, you can put some little lines in there. I like to put the lines in. It serves as guidelines for your signature. I've said it many times, but I think it's very important to put a signature on your workpiece and put a date on your workpiece. Many years from now, somebody might find this little precious box and wonder when it was made. I look through antique shops for little turned boxes, and I find quite a few, but they never have dates on them, and I would love it if they had a date on them. Some people don't like to date their work because they feel that it might hinder some sales if a piece is older than the older pieces may not sell, but my contention is if it's good work, it'll sell. So I don't think that's a consideration. I think it's much more important in the long term to have the date on there. When I'm sanding, after I finish with a 220 grit, I always wipe away the grit before I continue on with a finer grit. If there's any debris left from the 220, or the previous coarser grit, it'll just get picked up with the fine one and make your sanding job just a little bit longer. And you can buff it a little bit with the Scotch-Brite pad. And we'll put a sealer on that. I have kind of a bad habit of wrapping the rag around my finger. It's probably not a good idea. It could get tangled up in the lathe, and this is what I have a habit of doing, and it's nice to be able to keep the excess rag out of the way, but it's not a safe practice. I'll cut that back just a little bit. Some wood lends itself very well to being polished. You could take it through the polishing process of Tripoli and rouge on a buffing wheel. That'll remove all the fine sanding lines. The harder woods would lend themselves more to that type of process. Okay, that's not too bad. Now we can try the lid on. Sometimes putting this on the tenon will just stretch it just ever so slightly. Okay, we have just the grain needs to move over about 1/8 of an inch to be able to be lined up. But that's not something we want to have happen right at this point. We want to let the box stabilize just a little bit. There's a finished box. I've just shown you two different threading jigs. One is separate from the lathe. The project is turned on the lathe and then that's taken to the threading jig and the threads are generated. The other jig is now available for my lathe as an accessory, and you're able to cut the threads right on the lathe itself. The processes and the techniques for doing the threaded box are the same no matter which jig you use. There's something very special about a box with a threaded lid.